In this lab, we're going to have some specific equipment that we're going to need to use. First off, we're going to have our hot plate, and we're going to need to have a rod on our hot plate. This thing just screws in. It's found in the same spot as the hot plates. We're going to need a 250 milliliter Erlenmeyer flask. Our entire reaction is going to be done inside this flask, and you'll see that in just a moment. We're also going to need a 600 milliliter beaker. When we do our reaction, we're going to need to keep this under a pretty constant heat of about 100 degrees Celsius. The way we're going to accomplish that is by having this filled with water sitting on our hot plate, boiling, and then we're going to be able to take our flask here, and we're going to be able to insert this into our beaker. And that'll give us a pretty constant heat. So besides those, we're going to need a 50 milliliter graduated cylinder. This is going to be what we use to measure our distilled water. They're going to have a couple rounds of that. We're also going to need two 10 milliliter graduated cylinders. One of these is going to be used to measure our acetic anhydride, and the other is going to be used to measure some ethanol, which we'll use as a solvent later in the reaction. We're also going to need a number of 150 milliliter beakers. These are just beakers that are used to generally hold something. We're not going to necessarily measure something exactly in these. Later on in the lab, we'll be doing a recrystallization using boiling hot water. So we'll just fill one of these with some distilled water. We'll boil it, and then we'll measure out that boiled water. So with all of that equipment on hand, we can look at our materials. Here are all the materials that we're going to be using in this lab. First off, we have our main ingredients. Our salicylic acid. This is a white powder. It's a very fine powder. We have acetic anhydride, which is a liquid at room temperature. This is the anhydride form of acetic acid, which is the main component of vinegar. We're going to have some sulfuric acid, a very small amount of concentrated sulfuric acid. We will be literally adding just about 4 to 5 drops of this. So we'll also need some distilled water, and we're going to need some ethanol. The ethanol will act as a solvent later that will help us dissolve things when we need to, and the distilled water will come into play a couple different times. The first thing that we're really going to need in this lab is that this distilled water needs to be very cold. After we run through our reaction, we're going to need to stop our reaction and cool it down. And the way we're going to do that is by adding a certain amount of very cold distilled water. So the first thing we want to do is put this on ice. If we've got snow outside, we can just put this outside. Otherwise, we can just put it in the fridge in the back room. So once we have our distilled water on ice, ready to be nice and cold for when our reaction is done, the next thing we're going to want to do is get our hot bath ready. So we're going to grab this 600 milliliter beaker, and we're going to fill this up just a little bit with water. I'm going to place this on my hot plate, and I'm going to grab my 250 milliliter beaker, and I'm going to make sure that this is enough water. So I can see it's not quite enough, so I'm going to add a little bit more. And that should be good. So the way we're going to be putting this in is using this test tube clamp. So we're going to get this whole thing situated. Place it on top here. I just want to have this arranged ahead of time so that we don't need to be futzing with it while we've got our reaction going. So I'm going to take the time to get my Erlenmeyer flask in here. And see that it fits in nicely. I can put it down and lock it in place. Okay, so my equipment here is all set up and ready to go. So next I'm going to pull this off. I'm going to pull my Erlenmeyer flask out. Make sure this is open, easy to put back in. And then I'm going to turn on my hot plate. I'm going to turn my temperature all the way up. Then I'm going to wait for this to start to simmer. And then once this is starting to simmer, then I can put my ingredients into my Erlenmeyer flask so that I can put it in the hot bath. I don't want to put them all in before this is simmering because once I put my ingredients in, I want to go directly to the hot bath. There's no need for them to sit at room temperature, and it's just having chemicals open in the air ready to be accidentally knocked over while we're waiting for something else. So wait until this starts simmering, and then get your chemicals and put them in here, and then put it in the hot bath immediately. All right, I've got my 600 milliliter beaker filled with some boiling water. Now notice, it's not a rolling boil. Our hot plates aren't the most high-powered things, but I can keep this going steadily by and retain some water, remove some water loss by placing a little Florence flask on top of it. So you should do the same thing. You're probably not going to get this to a full boil without that. So we're just going to let this sit for now, and then I'm going to measure out my supplies. The first thing I'm going to measure is my salicylic acid. So I'm going to get a weigh boat here. I'm going to bring my scale to 0. So now we're set at 0. And I want to weigh out about 2 grams. And I'm going to record my exact weight in a lab journal somewhere. So that's about 1.27. All right, and that's 2.03. So that's a good amount. So we're going to take this. We're going to pour it into my little Erlenmeyer flask. I'm going to get as much as I can. Notice I still have some left in this weigh boat. You may not be able to see that on the camera. The lighting is kind of terrible. But I'm going to be able to get that using my acetic anhydride. Now for pouring my acetic anhydride, I don't want to have to pour directly from this bottle with this large mouth and this large volume directly into my graduated cylinder. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pour out a little bit into one of my 150 milliliter beakers. Now we want to make sure that these are reasonably clean because we're going to be pouring some of it back in. So I'm just going to pour out a little bit. And then I want to grab 5 milliliters. So I'm going to use a pipette. I'm just going to use the pipette to transfer it into my graduated cylinder. It'll allow me to be nice and precise without worrying about without spilling anything. Right there, that's about 5 milliliters. Great, that is 5 milliliters. So before I do anything else, I'm going to put my pipette aside. I'm going to take my beaker. I'm going to pour it back into my supply. Set it aside. You want to be careful with this stuff. So I'm going to seal it up, and I'm going to set it aside. Now I've got my acetic anhydride in here, and like I said, we're going to get the rest of just a little dust of the salicylic acid out of here by just pouring some in, just a little bit, just move it around a little bit. I'm going to pour it directly into my Erlenmeyer flask. I want to pour the rest in as well. Okay, set these both aside. I'm going to swirl my Erlenmeyer flask just a little bit just to kind of distribute the solid salicylic acid. Now the last step is I need to add in some sulfuric acid. At this point, this is where you're going to let me know that you're ready for the sulfuric acid, and I'm going to come over and we're going to do that together because concentrated sulfuric acid can be very dangerous. So we're just going to be very careful with it. So here I've got a little vial of some sulfuric acid, concentrated sulfuric acid, just set aside. And I'm going to be taking this vial. I'm just going to fill up the dropper just a little bit in there, and I'm just going to be adding about 4 or 5 drops. I want to do that slowly because as the sulfuric acid enters that solution, it does make a little bit of an exothermic reaction, which means that it's going to produce a bit of heat. So I'm just going to do it a little bit slowly. really not adding too much, so it's not too terrible. I'm just going to swirl it around, try and get a nice even mixture. And now everything I've got is in my Erlenmeyer flask. It's all ready to go. So the next thing I need to do is put this into my hot water bath. So I've got my Erlenmeyer flask filled with all of my reactants. I have my beaker with boiling water all ready to go. So I'm going to remove my Florence flask. And then my stand here is already set up from when we tested this. So I'm going to take my Erlenmeyer flask and I'm going to put it into my stand. So I want to make sure that it's nice and snug, nice and secure. I don't need to over tighten this. I don't need it to be squeezing so hard that the glass breaks, but I do need it just enough so that when I'm holding this firm, this isn't going to wiggle around, okay? So I can see that it's holding nice and steady. So now I'm going to just turn this. I'm going to put it directly into my beaker. So I just turn my knob on the back, and now I can lower this all down. Turn it a little more. I lower it in, then I tighten my back knob, and now I can just let this sit in here for about 15 minutes. We're going to let it react for 15 minutes at this nice hot temperature. You will see bubbles form and move around the Erlenmeyer flask. That is okay. Now that 15 minutes have passed, we are ready to remove our Erlenmeyer flask from our boiling water. But before we do, we need to grab that cold water that we've had sitting, and we need to measure out 40 milliliters. So I've got 40 milliliters measured out here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use my stand here to lift out my Erlenmeyer flask. I'm going to remove it from above the boiling water. And I'm just going to tilt this away. I'm just going to tilt this so that it's not pointing at anybody. Okay. Now I'm all ready to go. When you tilt this, you may notice that the liquid has changed to quite a light brown color. So now I'm just going to take my 40 milliliters of cool water. I'm going to pour this in order to stop the reaction. And I can see immediately it starts to change to a milky color. That is aspirin precipitating out of this solution. However, it's not going to be fully cold because this water did not fully cool this down. So our next step is to put this beaker, this Erlenmeyer flask, on ice to get this as close to 0 degrees Celsius as possible. When we do that, our aspirin will precipitate out as a crude product, and we'll see it gets very lumpy. So let's go ahead and put this on ice and let it sit on ice for about 30 minutes. If you need to leave it sit overnight, that's fine. We just need to put a cork in it and then let it sit like that.